We're very grateful to have the number of people on what is going to be the largest panel of the conference. So I'm going to do some very brief introductions for everybody, but I encourage you to use the QR code to, of course, take a deeper look at the excellence of the folks that we have here. We're building today on some of the amazing work that Citi presented to us yesterday around embedding trials into clinical practice. And this panel is intended to be a multi-stakeholder perspective on the barriers, the facilitators, the Canadianization of those from various different stakeholders in this group. This is intended to help all of our participants with the workshop today as well. So again, while we've got questions that I will be sharing with our panelists today, we really do welcome questions from the audience. So as we are going through the next hour or so, please feel free to stand up at the mics and ask any questions of any of the folks that are up here as well. So again, I want to just briefly introduce and welcome back Sara Bristol Calvert, for those of you who didn't meet her yesterday. Sara is Director of Projects at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. I also want to welcome back Michael Duong, who gave a great panel yesterday and is, as I said earlier, one of our co-chairs. I want to welcome Dr. Anne-Marie Mes-Masson, who is the Associate Scientific Director, Basic and Translational Research at the Center of Research at the University of Montreal Hospital, the Director of FRQS, which is a Quebec cancer network of over 100 scientists, for those of you who may not know, focused on translational and clinical cancer research, and a full professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Montreal. We also welcome Dr. Batist, who I have to give a shout out to, has been such a supporter of these conferences and such a guiding post as well since the inception. Jerry, you'll remember the very first conference we had. You were there guiding the implementation of the Citi guidelines. Dr. Batist is director of the Segal Cancer Center at the Jewish General here in Montreal. He is also the director of the McGill Center for Translational Research in Cancer and a professor in the Department of Oncology at McGill University. And last but not least, Karine, who is the president and CEO of the Quebec Breast Cancer Association. Thank you, everyone, for being here and participating in the panel today. Sara, I'm going to start with you. And throughout the past day or so, there's a lot of language used, interventional trials, pragmatic trials, adaptive trials. Sometimes the language can be a bit messy. So if you could just level set for our audience, the definition of an embedded trial and how it's different than some of the interventional language, pragmatic language, just to help people understand a little bit what they are.
Sure. I'll start with some of the people that work on our quality by design always remind us not to get bogged down in definitions, and that all of our point is to make trials better. And I'm not criticizing your question, though. I will give you an answer, too, is to make trials more simple and better and have quality in mind. But with pragmatic, some of my colleagues define that as, research that's intended to inform decision makers, and decision makers being patients, caregivers, also policymakers, administrators. So trying to reduce that uncertainty that Francois talked about yesterday. And the intent is to enroll a population who would benefit from that decision. And so whether it's the medical intervention, you want so that's where the real world component comes into pragmatic. And then either having a study that is focuses on power and makes the data collection very streamlined, and that's what you saw in the recovery trial, or you might have a little bit more data collected if it's pragmatic because you're trying to compare two therapies and you're trying to get a broad range of outcomes to fully do that. You still want to have a quality trial that's simple as you can, but you might be collecting a little bit more outcomes to compare those two therapies. And then embedded is, what we talked about yesterday. It's designed to get input from all stakeholders. It's integrated within the clinical care process. The data ideally is collected with existing sources, not collected again for the trial. Again, it's that representative of a diverse population, and the populations who intended to use the thing that you're testing, and the outcomes are important to policymakers. So those two, and my colleagues that work on the pragmatic trial collaboratory, they actually call it embedded pragmatic clinical trials, so they're very linked. Integrated trials, I'm not as familiar with that, but I believe it's a synonym of embedded, and maybe it's just a nod to the two integrating it within healthcare, although not to be confused for this conference to integrated trials when you're combining phases like phase 1 or 2, that kind of thing.
Right.
So that's not what we're talking about today.
Yeah. No, it just strikes me that the language is a bit messy and we need a dictionary. But so what is the key characteristic of an embedded trial from a city perspective?
I would say that it's part of healthcare, that it's not a separate process than healthcare.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I wanted to bridge into a conversation about examples of embedded trials. Sorry, my mic's cutting out a little bit. But of embedded trials in the Canadian context. And Jerry, we'll go to you first. And
Sure.
Yeah.
I can give you a couple of examples in two different contexts. Because, for example, and I think precision medicine, the emergence of precision medicine really makes the implication of the patients that much more important. We're talking about individual characteristics. A lot of the new drugs that we develop are developed, in fact, in the metastatic setting, often second or third line treatment. When we look at, say, molecular profiles, the easiest way to do this is to go back to the original primary tumor, which is accessible and stored in paraffin, and do sequencing on that. But we know that there's been a lot of evolution in those tumors. So over time, and over a course of a couple of treatments. So when we were developing clinical trials in a Quebec network called CRCHUM, we decided to start looking at the tumors that we were treating. In other words, doing biopsies of metastatic tumors, serial biopsies of metastatic tumors, in order to better position the patients and understand what the relationship is between that particular tumor and the response at that time to treatment. And that meant saying to patients at a time when they were just progressing on disease, your disease is progressing, and at the same time, would you consent to our biopsying your tumor? Not an easy thing to do at all. And so, that was 10 years ago when we were just starting to understand the importance of patient input. A second example, again, in the context of precision medicine, I think we've kind of moved the activity from actually doing the clinical trial to screening patients, to finding patient subgroups based on specific molecular profiles. And so we've built a program called Personalize My Treatment, Personnaliser Mon Traitement, in the Exactis organization, where patients give us consent to access their data, their clinical data, and to follow them. So we have consecutive sequential data, real-world data as they evolve, not necessarily in the context of a therapeutic trial, and all of their molecular data, and all of their imaging data, and all of their pathology data. And more than that, they give us the right to recontact them. Why do we recontact them? Because if we've done some molecular profiling, and not only do we recontact them to say, you fit into a particular trial opportunity, but there's some data there about unrelated diseases. You have an increased risk for some other disease. And that requires a lot of thought. There are ethical and legal questions. Do the patients even want to know that? So that necessarily required the involvement of patients in the governance of that data and the answering that question, is this something that should be shared with the patient? And this can only be answered by intimate patient involvement. So 2 little examples.
Yeah, thank you very much. Michael, did you want to add anything to the conversation on examples from industry perspective?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I would say is I was listening to Angie speak and thinking to myself, I shouldn't be on this panel. I'm not the clinical trial expert from an industry perspective. My job is in innovation, as you heard. But I'm happy to feed in because my job is also to disrupt what we do within our company and industry, and clinical trials is extremely important there. So I do understand a little bit about it, enough to disrupt it, not clearly enough to give the keynote speak. But from our perspective, like I think this notion of embedded clinical trials, integrated clinical trials, whatever you may call it, I think the interesting component for us, not so much examples of what we're doing, because as I mentioned, we don't have any examples of that yet, but I think examples of how we're preparing. And I think to Jerry's point, a lot of the work that we've done over the last few years has been preparing for not even knowing the future of this embedded clinical trial. So building up the infrastructure within Canada. I think to Barry's point before, talking about how if we have the opportunity to collect the data that informs these types of trials in real world clinical practice, we need data infrastructure within clinical practice that is collecting data of sufficient quality and of sufficient comprehensiveness in order to inform these trials. Yeah. The biggest thing for us as manufacturers, I think, as we think about these innovative clinical trial designs, is the risks that we put on our own businesses and our own investments into these molecules. As we explore these innovative trial designs, I go to my global trial teams and say, you should try this, you should do this, you should think about doing this, and they come back and say, it's a $2 billion investment. Do you want me to experiment with these innovative ideas on our $2 billion investment? And I go back and I say, okay, that's a good point. So it's extremely challenging for us, especially from the Canadian lens, to say, can we do this, which is heartening for me to hear, these recommendations coming out of the U.S. FDA, coming out of organizations working with the U.S. FDA, because, quite frankly, the U.S. is what drives a lot of our decisions around clinical trial design.
And by the way, Michael, I think you were the perfect person to answer that question because it is innovation in trials. Thank you very much. Dr. Mes-Masson, I wanted to bring you into the conversation to present and talk about the research perspective, the researcher's perspective. Where are embedded trials in Canada that you're aware of? Have you had personal experience with them? What is the future of them here?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd want to make 2 points. First of all, I am not a clinician, so I am a Ph.D. scientist, but some of my best friends are clinicians, some of them sitting right here, actually. And so we have had the pleasure of working with them. One of the innovations that I saw at our own academic center is in radiation oncology. And in all trials, usually there's a randomization phase where but what you're doing is you're comparing whatever intervention you want with the control, the standard of care. Where is the state of the art today? And we want to compare to that. Is it better or worse? And so in the radiation oncology group, they did a huge effort in data collection on all of their patients so that all of the information that you would need to enroll them as a control group would already be present there. So every time they launched a new trial, they already had patients at about the same time who were getting this, the standard of care that they could now enroll as the controls in those trials. And so that was an innovation that helped them. And it was always based on the fact that they had collected the appropriate data from the patients that were just being treated on standard of care. So the same. The other thing where research has, I think, really helped is in the translational space. We have large-scale projects like the Marathon of Hope or the Exactus project that are data hungry, that they want to acquire this data. So it's providing us with a source of financing for us to be able to cull that data out of our data lakes, have it in a form that's good for basic or translational research, but at the same time, it's the same data that you have to organize for clinical research. So we are culling through what we already have at our institutions and organizing it in such a way that we're seeing what can we draw out automatically. And at our own institution, we have a Citadel, which is really what is organizing the data lake, and they ran an experiment comparing their data capture to capture of an ongoing trial. And they showed that their data quality was in fact higher because you're not re-entering data, you're just pulling data out of a data source. So it shows that it's a valuable, it's expensive to do, but research, sometimes the translational research is helping fund that innovation that'll help you capture those data points that you need for the trial.
Yeah, thank you very much. Karine, I'm going to go to you as well, and just to provide the patient perspective on the future of clinical trials, the role of embedded trials, and where patient groups and patients fit into that.
Yeah, I mean, as an advocacy group, but also an organization that invests in research, because we do believe in it, it's essential. I think we also have an important role into educating patients. Literacy in healthcare is at a low, in Quebec anyway. And it begins before they get sick, to going through, for example, breast cancer, working with the different instances, the hospitals, the researchers, the universities, into finding ways to reach the patient. I'm happy to hear more and more that the patient is at the center of our decisions, because in the end, it is for them that we do everything we do, that we invest so much. But I think, and all of them would be willing to jump on board, share the data. When you ask most people, if you explain what the data is for, they usually jump on board quickly because they can see all the benefits of taking part of such clinical trials. In the end, it's for them and it's for everyone else. And sometimes for some of them, it's their last line of trials. It's essential. So I think we'll have to work more into educating, but I think as our role progresses and as they are more and more integrated into hospitals and pharmas and everything else, and as it was questioned earlier by another patient group, to also refer the patients to the proper groups would be beneficiary for everyone into a higher participation rate.
So do you think that the idea of embedded trials done differently, where is this going to elevate the need for more patient group involvement in the process? And in what ways?
I think so. I mean, if you involve them more, they participate fully. They tend to stick right through. It might change the healthcare practices in the long run, which I think we all agree we need in this province and everywhere else. It'll help us, I think if we include them in the design, we bring it in, it'll be more inclusive. We can reach out to more groups that are not represented, that are often forgotten, or we can't reach them. I think that's where we can help as well, because we're connected to the patients. They usually call us when they don't know what to do or where to go. So it's definitely beneficial.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something you said about healthcare professionals needing to change. Jerry, maybe I could get you to comment on that. What changes do you think have to occur from a HCP perspective as we think about trials done in practice?
Yeah, I think it's an extremely important point. There's a cultural change that we've been struggling with for a long time for people to really appreciate that clinical research is simply a part of best care. You can't have best care without having a clinical research option. And even within our institutions and the prioritization of patients, I think I work very hard every day with all of my colleagues across disciplines to help people understand that for this patient at this moment, this is their best treatment, the clinical trial. So it's simply integrated into clinical care. One of the first times that I presented the Exactis consent form, the idea of following patients throughout their trajectory, in other words, entering into their standard of care, It was at a Coalition Cancer meeting, and the patients spontaneously rose long lines behind the microphones of people asking, where do I sign up? People want to be implicated and involved. I think that's, and I think all of this can be patient-driven. We all want the best for our patients. We do what our patients push us to do. And so I think that the way to do all transformation is really by creating patient-led movements. Sometimes physicians and nurses can participate. But I really think, we need to start thinking about this in terms of a movement. We need almost a political movement. We need to be driving policy and politicians to do things. And I say that because it's shocking to me that all of the obstacles that we see to getting to where we want to go are obstacles that completely disappeared during the years of the pandemic. So we can accomplish this. We know that regulatory policy can change on a dime. We know that HR policy can change on a dime, that the REBs can approve things over a weekend. We did all those things 3 years ago. So having done that, it's very hard for us to default back to a normal, which was inadequate in the first place.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to jump, and I know you wanted to keep this informal, so I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, please do. And we would love questions from the audience, too. If you feel free to stand up the mic. The lights are blinding a bit, but I'll see you.
I think Jerry said something really important there, and I just wanted to call it out, is that the best care is in clinical research, right? Like clinical trial research is the best care, and we, within the institutions of research, understand that. But I think if you go out there and you talk to the public, they say, whoa, you're going to embed a clinical trial into my clinical care, like my practice, they're going to think it's experimental. They're going to think there's uncertainty associated with it. They're going to think that there's risk there. They don't yet understand is too strong of a word, but there's some skepticism there that the notion of clinical research, clinical trial is actually providing the best care possible to patients. And I think if we can get level of understanding out there to say we are embedding the best elements of the clinical trial enterprise into routine clinical practice so that we can deliver the best care possible to patients, I think you'll get much more uptake, public awareness, and public advocacy for this. To your point, it needs to be a groundswell effort to come up and say we need this within care in Canada, because we talk about how to improve health outcomes for patients. We talk about what we need to do within the healthcare system to bring better healthcare to patients. This, I think, is going to be it, but they have to understand that it is linked, it is associated.
Thank you. Yes.
I want to
Mes-Masson.
maybe point out how hard this is. I work in a teaching hospital, so does Jerry. It's difficult even within that setting where you expect a mindset of physicians and care teams that are there to be totally focused on research and you know, the most innovative and avant-garde care. How difficult that this notion that we should have clinical, you know, one of our trialists, Dr. Robidou, who has since passed but is well known, was always of the mindset, I need a trial for every patient that's in front of me. I need to have a suite of trials so that any woman who comes to me with breast cancer, I have that. But that's not the mindset of, I would say, the majority of our physicians, even in an academic setting. So as you go outside of academic setting, that gets even harder. So it's going to take a lot of will from, you know, I'm encouraged by our new PDG, who is really of the mindset that the U is very important in the CHUM and that we have to be university hospital. We need that from the politicians. We need that from the funding agencies. There has to be that will to recognize the importance of clinical research and to continuously push it at all levels.
Thank you. I'd like to bring it back to Sara, because these conversations must have been the impetus and the genesis of the new recommendations. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and it is always we're looking for ways to make trials higher quality and more efficient, and this is both, making it part of quality healthcare, and ideally, when all the infrastructure is set it up, making it more efficient and not duplicating effort. So that definitely was the reason that it came up, and the case studies of people doing it. So we're like, oh, look, this is happening. How can we make it happen on a broader scale?
Yeah. Now, you raised the issue of culture change behavior as being one of the key, I'll call them barriers or needs as part of your model. Maybe you could provide some insights on what's been done so far, some of the conversation that's happened in the US around cultural shifts that are needed, steps that have been taken thus far.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jerry made an important point. Wasn't an issue when everybody just made things happen, and we need to make, during the pandemic, all the things that people were worried about or saying they couldn't happen, we made it happen. So how do we not slide back? But it's also making the case for every individual provider. I mean, making the case for providers that we can reduce your uncertainty, making the case for patients that you don't have to go to extra study visits, making the case for healthcare systems that people will regard you as a world-class healthcare system where people get the best care, and making the case for policymakers that you'll have better evidence to make your decisions on. So there's making the case for every individual person, and there's benefits for everybody. And if people are looking at it as only the barriers or the hardships that it will do for them, we need to address those barriers, but we really need to focus on those benefits. That it's going to benefit everybody if we make learning healthcare systems.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled. People are
Can I
standing
just-
up at the mics, but yes, of course.
I also think actually we can kind of collapse different efforts or integrate different efforts together. For example, there's a whole program of patient-reported outcomes. I mean, lots of efforts to do that. In fact, I think that's the explanation for the published data that patients in clinical trials, even if they're getting the same treatment, do better. And that's because there are more people looking at them, and they're reporting outcomes earlier, side effects, not waiting for the next appointment. So the presentation we heard this morning was a perfect example of PROs coming to the patients where they otherwise wouldn't in the context of a clinical trial, because that's how you're setting it up. And I think that all of the energy going into PROs and embedding clinical trials into clinical practice can be integrated. It's exactly the same kind of effort.
Thank you. I'm going to go to questions from the floor, and I'm sorry. Stuart, hi.
Yeah, Stuart Nichols, Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. I just wanted to sort of make a couple of comments, and the first is that there's an Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium now that's been funded kindly through CRCHUM. Part of that consortium's work is going to be a public awareness campaign around clinical trials, so there will be opportunities in the not too distant future to sort of facilitate a greater awareness of clinical trials, the benefits of them, and all the good that comes with that. So just to say that is coming down the line. The other thing is a sort of maybe a concrete example of something that's been changed to try and overcome some of the barriers that we've done locally, which is our permission to contact. So usually when people come into the hospital, they're asked, can you be contacted about research? And there was always a barrier there because it was assumed that someone within the circle of care had to make the initial contact. Our institution has just, through various conversations, gone back and said, actually, nowhere in TCPS does circle of care appear in the ethics. And actually, what it is an health information custodian. And the institution has now determined that some research staff can be deemed to be health information custodians. And so that overcomes this barrier where we used to have a clinician make the first contact, then bring the researcher in. So I'm just saying there are sometimes perceived barriers that when they're reviewed again can actually be overcome and find very clear ways to go forward. And then finally, a bit of a loaded question to the panel. Most of our consent forms have a line in the benefits section say, you may not directly benefit from taking part in a clinical trial. And I just wondered, what are the thoughts on that and actually saying, actually, you may get benefits from taking part in this clinical trial. There may be benefits to taking part in clinical research. Thank you.
Does anyone want to take that last question on the consent form?
I'd just say, for having lived it myself in a waiting room for results, having a researcher come to my husband next to me. I would push it further. I would get patients who went through a program to do that. Because as Michael said, you say research and most people's first initial reaction is, oh my God, I'm a test tube. What's going to happen to me? So often the patients have that view because they're unaware of this amazing world of advancement into healthcare, which is also why it's important to embed it into the clinical follow-up, because it's your actual doctor, or it's a doctor in your institution that you know that seems to you as a patient closer to you. So I think, and it's starting in some areas, to have actual patients who went through clinical trials and are still there because of those clinical trials, to be able to talk to patients on behalf of the researchers instead of them or the nurses or the help that are often doing the best they can, but have that a bit of clinical status to them, which tends to scare the general population who doesn't even have what it takes to take care of their own health to begin with. So that's like a step above. And so I think we have to take it from the ground up, educate, be on the ground, and be there to help explain to the patients.
I just also wanted to add to that to say, like, that line in the consent form has to be it has to be longer than a line. It has to talk about the benefit of participating in a clinical trial, not just for the patient, but for society, for everybody, for research, for knowledge, for, you know, the improvement of the entire healthcare system, from, you know, the innovations that we find within that therapeutic area all the way through. So I think the notion of benefiting as an individual, yeah, I mean, obviously in a clinical trial, there may not always be the promise of benefit to the individual, but there always is a promise of benefit to society and the ecosystem as a whole.
Thank you. You've been so patient. Thank you.
Hi, Eva Villalba from the Quebec Cancer Coalition. So first of all, a comment. Well, I was only going to make one, but just to support what Karine has said, there's really great initiatives of patient partners and peers actually influencing better. So I think that's a great avenue. But my first comment was about this notion of uncertainty that kept coming up. And Michael had said something like, you know, patients are going to feel like there's uncertainty in a clinical trial. Of course there is. There is uncertainty. We have to be honest and transparent with patients. However, what's not transparent right now is that the standard of care is also uncertain. There's no standard of care that's like 100% effective for everyone all the time. And so it's true, right? So I think that just making that kind of explanation, taking the time to really explain that clinical trials often have the same rates of, you know, promise and uncertainty as the standard of care. I think that's not diminishing or you know, it's being transparent about the real uncertainty, but at the same time giving people all the information that they need to make that informed decision. And so my real question is, because we were addressing, you know, and I think that embedding clinical trials in practice is something we're really trying to promote from the political and organizational standpoint. But currently, in the even when we don't have standard care pathways in Quebec necessarily for all things, and because we only look at it from the first line of treatment, and there's not that many, you know, we wish that there was only one line of treatment for cancer, but often there isn't. So how do we ensure that it's standardized, but then also, and I'm always thinking about what are the incentives. So if we're not measuring it, if there's no obligation, yesterday we saw, and Sara had mentioned that, you know, when there's actually an incentive for patient engagement, and some people were talking about CRCHUM grants that, you know, force clinicians or force researchers to actually have patient engagement, and lo and behold, we have patient engagement. Why is there not an indicator or an incentive for clinicians to refer to clinical trials? We don't know how many we have, so maybe, Jerry, you have an answer about that.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for why there isn't, but I just want to emphasize the fact that there must be. In Quebec, I just online renewed my contract as a physician, and there's a series of obligations that I have, and missing from that was an obligation to talk to my patients about clinical trial opportunities for them, which the ministry could put in there. They could oblige every medical oncologist, every oncologist to to make sure that their patient has a biopsy, access to NGS, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think that this could be written into our job description, even as we try to convince people. The other thing, though, I think that's really important in Canada, Quebec and in Canada, is we have a real problem with delays in access to new, proven, effective drugs that are being used in standard of practice elsewhere in the world. And we use clinical trials to provide our patients with access to those drugs. And personally, and I think most people are pretty explicit about that. There's a drug here. Now, we have been very cautious, all of us, in not talking about this too publicly to our patients, because imagine saying to the public, there are things that could help you that are not available to you. That's a horrible message, and we've been afraid to create the kind of panic that would in the public. But Ev and I recently wrote an op-ed piece in La Presse, and I think we've crossed that Rubicon, and now is the time to sound the alarm and to let the public understand, because again, we need a movement. But in the meantime, we are using clinical trials, and we're conveying to patients, this is a good drug for you, and you can access this in a clinical trial. So the opportunities for the patients are implicit, if not explicit, in the consent forms.
Great, thank you. Stephen, you've been patient as well. Thank you.
I want to build on, as always, Eva has a great probative and provocative question. Jerry, building on your last comment, just maybe putting my PACT hat on for a moment, and to the fellow attendees here, I think that's to your point about within your licensure and you're renewing your agreements, I think that's a phenomenal enabling strategy, right? There's a carrot and stick approach to implementation and changing practice for patient groups to lobby for, right? Who better to make that case to the OMA, the Quebec agency? So I think if there's a takeaway, and if someone's recording this, I know it's being recorded, but that's something that we can look at and mobilize the patient groups and patient community to advocate for. I think that would alone have a remarkable impact. So thank you for raising that. My question or comment was to the culture of research in institutions. And Michael, your comment was that, within your institution, that's becoming embedded. And Anne-Marie added to that by talking about just how work has to be done within institutions to have colleagues, physician colleagues, accept trials as a component of care, or even just have their minds there when they're seeing their patients in terms of offering that. Just acknowledging, I wear an N2 hat as well, and there was a regional meeting in London, Ontario a couple weeks ago where this very question came up. And just to point out, the reality is within the tertiary institutions that were there, it wasn't just London, it was an acknowledgement that it's also the supporting departments like pharmacies and imaging, where that's not the case, right? So within institutions, there was a recognition that from a top down, there needs to be built into those tertiary centers specifically an acceptance of trials and research as a component of care. And that's actually not uniformly the case when it trickles down. So just acknowledging the reality, even at Canada's hospitals with cancer, Canada's Cancer Center, because it doesn't trickle out to all departments, it doesn't trickle out through all disciplines. So building a culture of research should start there, but then there's that recognized, and there was a discussion of that ground-up approach where the interactions that trial units have with those supporting departments and the prioritization of their requests or requirements for supporting patients on trial often get dropped or they get lowered because they are not recognized in daily practice as much of a priority as the other services that they provide in the context of clinical care. So I just wanted to, it's not so much a question, but if there's comments to that or experiences to that, I just wanted to share that. That was a response from about 100 attendees from those centers acknowledging that, and there wasn't really any argument to that in the room at the time.
Thank you, Stephen. Change management is hard.
Can I ask maybe, Stephen, if you stay up at the mic, because you were at the conference and I wasn't. How much of that conversation around being able to prioritize this within an institution, and keep in mind, I don't work at an institution, so I don't know, but how much of that conversation has brought in incentivization? Because we've heard it before from Jerry and from Barry that if we are to prioritize clinical research, even within an academic medical center, let alone a community center, there must be incentivization for that coming from either the C-suite level or ministry level to say, if you prioritize this, you will be incentivized.
Yeah, it was recognized there wasn't as a component of it, but I think, you know, when we talk about a culture of research, that was the focus. Yeah, incentivizations were certainly discussed from both of those avenues. The other interesting point that is raised, it might shock some people, but anyone who comes from a clinical or a institutional setting, it depends on your institution, of course, and your province you're from, but pretty predominantly, clinical research professionals pay scales are not at the level of clinicians or clinical care providers. In many cases, that's a huge barrier to, and there's a trickle out effect in terms of how research is perceived, right? And internally within the institution, as healthcare or allied health move into research, that's a bit of a shock that they see, but it sends a message from the institution if that's not recognized as a clinical support and an equivalent support service for patients. So it might be shocking to patients to hear that. But
Can I address that?
Yeah, and I do want to also bring, we've got Sara who's ahead of us as well. I want to understand if you can bring U.S. perspective and city model perspective on this. But Jerry, please.
I sit down.
You know, as with everything, it varies across the country. As it happens in Quebec, the system of remuneration for at least the physicians, we have a remuneration mixed system. We do very, very well. There's no differential at all, and it's perfectly set up to oblige people to do this. So but I think the incentivization for the institution can come in many forms. For example, we dropped this because of the pandemic at my place, but we're picking it up again. At one point, the radiology department realized, the diagnostic radiology department realized that our patients on clinical trials in our clinical research unit were doing a lot of CT scans at a private CT scan paid for by the sponsor. And so we just collated all of that, and it was quite clear that we did enough that it would support buying a new CT scan for research and paying for the staff, and it would provide increased capacity for non-trial patients. And so the radiologists were incentivized, highly incentivized, to start to value clinical research, even for standard of care patients. So the incentivization can come in many, many forms. We should be open to it and look for all these opportunities.
Great example. Actually, that very example came up from one of the participants in the meeting a couple weeks ago, saying they made a business case to the institution, and they acknowledged as clinicians and researchers, they're not very good at making business cases, and they need to do that because that changes hearts and minds. So that exact example was discussed within Lawson Health Research Institute in London as a way to change attitudes. Even if there's a culture that's being infused or is transforming at the institution, you have to have some motivation kicked in behind that. So,
Thank you. Before we go on to another question, Sara, I'd really love your comments on this because you brought up the issue of cultural change, healthcare professional change. How is the city model looking at some of these issues around change management?
We're continuing work with some of our partners. So I mean, we always, collaboration is key. People are doing success stories everywhere. We need to bring it all together and make the business case and make the case from the prior places where it's worked. If you build the infrastructure, then it works and you can do efficient trials. So even in the US, so the I-SPY trial is a good example of that, where they invested in infrastructure and now they're able to do it. And the same academic medical centers, you come into one and you know that they talk about providing evidence-based care. So how can we translate that out to places in the community? That's why you see research happening in those maps we saw yesterday, because people have done this, but we need to pull it all together and make those successful examples. Embedding in care is not new. We've been doing that, but it's all the pieces and the technology that's available now gives us the ability to do it on a larger scale. You know, we've been looking at the first generation medical records. We were querying those for eligible patients a long time, and going back and not bothering patients for outcomes that were aligned with care. If you're doing I'm in primary care when I was still doing clinical work, so I mean, making sure that we could look at the A1C, but we didn't have to draw it ourselves. Like that, we've been doing that for years, but making that large scale, and the big medical records can do that, and we have to harness all of that and pay to harnessing all of that so that we can then use it. But making the case, you get a lot of attention if you do a really exciting, flashy trial. So making the case for everybody to do that. So I wouldn't say that there's still particular examples. We haven't figured it out, but we need to remind people they've been doing this, and let's just put it all together and then expand it out with the new technology that we have to be able to do this.
Right, thank you. So there's wonderful, what I call small steps that are in place today that can be leveraged. Barry, you've been also very patient. Thank you. Or
let Linda go ahead, and I'll
yes.
close up.
Hi, Linda.
Okay, thank you, Barry. I want to put on a different hat, and I'm so glad so many of you have spoken about incentivization and also how can we do this culture change. So in my past, before I got sick, I was a chief nursing executive and a VP of clinical care of 3 different hospital institutions and long-term care. And I will tell you, at the C-suite level, there's 2 interesting things. Usually, not always, but usually, whoever is the CEO of the research institute attached to the academic health center is also a vice president of research in the institution anyway, at the academic health center level. So they all sit in the same C-suite. And looking back, I would say that everyone at the top level probably says research is very important, we want to be innovative, we want to push things forward. But I think what doesn't happen, and I think this is what you alluded to, it doesn't come down to the bottom, it doesn't come down to the grassroots, and it doesn't come down to frontline staff. And Sara, what you just said is so interesting. I'm dating myself here, but almost 40 years ago when I was a clinical ICU nurse at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, world-renowned heart institute, and we worked there, the critical care nurses were embedded in every single clinical trial, and we did all the blood work and all the procedures and all the ECGs. So we got away from that, and we created clinical research professionals, which is fantastic, and there has to be some incentivization to pay them better, because I'll tell you, most people that become CRPs tend to be healthcare professionals who want to get away from shift work, and they want to work Monday to Friday. So that's an incentivization in and of itself, that you'll take a little bit of a less pay depending on where you work. But I think if we could work at that middle management level, the directors of care, the managers of care, and bring in that grassroots level from the people that are providing the pointy end care, we can really do a good job in incentivizing why research is so important, but it's everyone's shoulders of responsibility to do so. But Jerry, I want to talk about something that you said, and I want to relate it back to yesterday. Yesterday, Dr. Alan Forrester said, in answer to a question, I was saying this to Sara. It took me 12 hours to figure out what my rebuttal should have been, so I didn't get to it till the middle of the night. However, we were talking about patient power and working with patient agencies and moving things forward for patient centricity. And he said, until the system changes, you will just have to accept, or we are accepting, that the system is not as patient-centric as we all want it to be. And it's going to be the payment of allowing it to be more patient-centric. And one of our peers, you brought up, let's twist this on its head and say, pay the money to the patient, and then you can go and get the services you need, obviously within parameters. My thought right now, and you said, Why do patient organizations, of which I belong to two, very humble patient organizations that get very limited funding, we're always screaming out for healthcare providers, clinical trialists to join us in making power to the push to government and policy changes. And I don't know about other patient organizations in the room. I find sometimes being on the board of these organizations, one's with arthritis, one's with fibromyalgia, we're always trying to find people to work with us to push this forward. So sometimes when we hear we need a patient groundswell movement, there is an international patient groundswell movement that is working so hard 24/7 that feels that it doesn't get the power from the people that work within the system, that are doing the research and that are taking care of us. So yeah, time is now. Let's please work together so that we can push some of these changes together. And I just want to say thank you for bringing it up.
This is what we need to hear. I think it's extremely important. The patients and the people in the healthcare system are accepting l'inacceptable. We're accepting the unacceptable, and it's very hard for me to. We talk about how we have to educate the public and make them less fearful of clinical trials. My heavens, for all our hundreds of thousands of dollars on demystification of clinical research and all of that we did for years, in the course of the pandemic, we have people walking down the street talking about efficacy data and toxicity data and phase 3 trials. The public understands. And why was it unacceptable for people with COVID to be dying? We mobilized everything, and all the rules were changed, and all the walls came down. At its worst point, cancer was killing 5 times as many people as COVID. So now and what did we do? We mobilized innovation and research to overcome it. And that's going to be the solution for cancer. We're facing a tsunami of cancer now as a consequence of the pandemic. We can't increase capacity. The capacity is shattered as a result of the pandemic. So we have to go back to innovation, and that means making everything work faster, all the things you're talking about. And we need a groundswell of patient voices. You're also voters. And, we recently had the health minister in a closed session, so I'll tell you this in confidence, say to us,
you heard it here first.
And healthcare research is not a priority for Canadians. And it shocked me, but I think what he's saying is, in choosing which party they're going to vote for, it's not a priority. And that's because none of them are giving us any inspiration or any vision for healthcare advance. And we have to push them to do that. We have to use every opportunity to make these people, who after all are afraid for their health as well. As human beings, they get it, but as policymakers, they're stuck, and we have to help them unstick themselves.
I am, in the interest of time, and I feel like the terrible person cutting this off. Barry, I'm going to give you the final word, and then we have to end. I think this is the lightning rod for action, though, and it's been quite incredible to have the passion at which people have approached the microphones. So, Barry, final word.
This should have been the end of the whole conference, because we have the advocacy, going forward from it all.
I don't want to be the person putting water on this either.
I'll come back to a couple of things that everybody said. So first of all, Stuart, fully agree that while we have that statement in the consent documents that you may not benefit from it, I don't think one patient has actually read that. Because most people that actually want to participate in a clinical trial, unfortunately, are hearing about it way too late. They're stage 4 patients, for example. I was myself. I'll come back to that in a second. Time for confessions, Jerry. So the idea, though, that most patients, I think, do participate in clinical trials is because they see it as part of their treatment care, a continuum of their treatment care. They are hopeful that it will make a difference. Notwithstanding those warnings that, yes, this is just, for other patients, I don't think that that is the culture of the patient. And I think that, coming back to what you said, Anne-Marie, about consenting, and you, Jerry, as well, about consenting of patients. Patients are very willing to consent, but they should be consented early on, right at the very beginning, so that you could have all my information for the rest of my life, as far as I'm concerned, for research purposes. So I think that using the consent or the information, the data in the Citadel program is genius. I think that's fantastic. And I think that it would be great if we can go to all patients now and actually reverse it and saying that you're deemed to have consented to using your data for research unless you opt out, right? So that we have that opportunity to have greater access to data. So I said it's time for confessions, and I always tell people that we do invite Jerry Batist here for his genius, but the really reason is because I believe in personalized medicine. I like to keep my oncologists very personal and close to me. So Jerry has been my oncologist going back to when we were both much younger, almost 30 years ago, when he was a young oncologist and I was a much younger patient at the time. And I had stage 4 cancer and started to look at the treatments, which were very limited. And actually nobody told me about that apart from surgery and just having one drug. So I started to look around for clinical trials and actually found some things that were clinical trials, some which were borderline clinical trials, which were standard practice in the US. But what I had, and which Jerry was able to provide me, and so thankfully, is I had a quarterback here who helped work with me to find the clinical trials or those treatments that might help me prolong my life. And I don't even think that once it was a discussion that this was a clinical trial and you may not benefit or anything like that. It was, yeah, you'll do this and we'll see what happens. We'll see how it progresses. We'll keep pushing back on what goes on. So it requires a cultural change among patients, first of all, to understand the clinical trials are not necessarily, or maybe a continuum of your care, and you can benefit, Stuart, so I do think that that is a good thing. The second thing is the consent. We have to have early consent of these things, but we also need to create, and it's something that we're working on, a community of practice, at least in the GI oncology area, so that oncologists will share the trials. And this is also a cultural change because clinicians are not sharing their trials as much. They're not referring their patients to other trials in other centers as much as they could. And maybe it is, as Alan said, because they're not incentivized. Alan Forster yesterday said they're not incentivized to do so, and we need to incentivize them to do so. But this is a cultural change. So there is the cultural change from the patient perspective, from the institutional perspective on how to obtain those consents up front, or from the policy perspective, and also from the individual clinician collaboration in terms of a community of practice to work together to accelerate trials. Never forgetting that we have at best 7% participation in cancer clinical trials in Canada. It's pitiful. So really this is a sense of urgency, and come back to the advocacy that we were calling out for, both from Eva and Stephen and yourself, Jerry. This is really something that we need to bring about in Quebec, and to bring back to the conversation yesterday about how the Minister of Innovation, and this could be federally or provincially, and the Health Minister actually have to work together towards those common goals together.
Thank you, Barry. I want to close this panel and give each panelist just a very brief moment, because I'd like to leave this on a very positive note. The concept of galvanizing practice informs research, the concept of embedded trials in Canada. Anne-Marie, if I could start with you. What is the biggest benefit of bringing embedded trials to fruition?
Well, I think it's the efficiency and the access, larger access to the multiple patients. And if I can add one little comment, I think one of the big things that mobilized the population when it came to the pandemic was that ticker tape that we all looked at every morning to see how many infections there were, how many people were dying. And I'm, you know, now that we have this whole system in place for counting, we should do the same thing for cancer so people in Canada could realize the scope and we could focus more attention on it.
Thank you. Michael.
I think a lot of what we talked about here, and we ended with the advocacy, is around, it's very similar to how we run innovation at Roche. It's that it's community-led. So, and we saw it in the pandemic, is that the power of the community is immense. And if we can activate the community for these challenges that we have right now, not only do we come with more diverse and more innovative solutions, but we come with the power of the community to affect change. So, if anything, around this, maybe the secret sauce is community-led here.
Thank you.
I just want to shine a light on an example of something that responds exactly to what you just said, Barry. CRCHUM has communities of practices, and the lung cancer group called the RAZAT has, every lung cancer patient in Quebec gets a panel of relevant NGS, molecular data, and one email gets all of them talking to each other, all the medical oncologists taking care of all lung cancer patients, and they've, as a group, decided to place one trial with a rare group in one hospital, and everyone send their patient to that site. And this is going on all of the time, and Quebec has won the merit of being top recruiter for some very rare subgroups worldwide a few times, and we're going to do this in colorectal cancer. And after this meeting, I'm talking about a GYN trial that will put everyone together. There is a volonté to work together. We have to facilitate it.
Thank you. Karine.
I think for the patient, it would be accessibility to the best care possible. So that's the main goal. That's why it's so important.
So beautifully said. Thank you. And we're so very grateful that Citi has lit a fire on this conversation in the Canadian market. What do you see? How has your team thought about the biggest benefit of these new recommendations, and what is your rallying cry, so to speak, going forward?
We often talk internally about, our mission says improve the quality and efficiency of clinical trials, but there's always the why. Why do we do that? And it's to get more and better treatments to patients. And that's our ultimate goal. And the promise of this is that it's, unfortunately for clinical trials, that was only meant a small sliver of patients. And so now this has the promise to, as Karen and Anne-Marie said, expand access, expand those proven therapies and the opportunity to participate in getting more proven therapies and decreasing that uncertainty to all patients and where they receive care already. So that's what all of our projects do, and this has the promise to expand that.
Great. I want to thank our panel, and I want to thank all of the amazing conversation today. I loved what I call the spiritedness. There's clear desire to move this forward. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back with a panel led by Dr. John Marshall. We'll take this conversation to even another level.